One of the key themes in Romans is the gospel. The gospel is only referenced 12 times, though. 3 times the verb, euangelizomai, the middle of euangelizo, to preach the gospel. And of course, the Greek word euangelion, good news or gospel. So the verb is found 3 times, and the noun another 9 times. So you'd think 12 times. Does that really justify the gospel being seen as the theme of Romans? Well, I actually think that it's where it's placed, or the language is placed, that's so important. Paul begins the letter by referring to him being set apart for the gospel of God. And then he speaks about some elements of it. It's promised beforehand in the Holy Scriptures. It concerns his son, who's a descendant of David and declared to be the Son of God through power. And then it mentions the death and resurrection of Jesus, a nice, neat summary of the gospel. And then as the prologue or the initial part of Romans plays out, you have reference to the gospel again in 1:15 and 16, where Paul states his desire to come to Rome to preach the gospel. This is a fascinating passage because he says to you. So does he mean to the unbelieving Romans, or does he mean to the Roman church? And so Peter O'Brien would say he's talking more here about the church, because you in Romans generally means the Roman church. So he's wanting to embed his gospel in that community, or better, God's gospel, the gospel of grace through faith, to ensure that it's not a Judaizing gospel or a compromised gospel in any way. But of course, he does want to have a harvest among them, he says, as in the rest of the nation. So he's wanting to preach to both believer and unbeliever. And of course, rightly understood, gospel preaching includes what we do on a Sunday in our churches, which should be gospel preaching, even if not all the gospel is preached every Sunday. But over time, the gospel is preached, and hopefully a good version of the whole gospel on a regular basis, giving people opportunity to come to Jesus. Most would agree the thematic statement of the letter is 1:16 and 17, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And we have here the great articulation of the central theme of the gospel in Romans, to that faith is what is needed for justification before God, to be declared righteous before God. So gospel language dominates the first part of Romans. We also find it at the end of Romans, where we have an inclusio in Romans 16:25, where Paul talks about his gospel. And we have a little inclusio being like a framing device, where he speaks of the obedience of faith. His mission is to bring people to the obedience of faith in the nations, and he ends the letter with the same thing. So this tells us that the obedience of faith, or the obedience that springs from faith, or the obedience that flows by the Spirit from faith, is what his mission is about, and what the letter is all about. Gospel language is also found in chapter 10, when Paul speaks of the Jewish rejection of the gospel, although people came and preached to them. And as a result, the Jews have heard the gospel but refused it in many cases. Not all Jews, of course, because Paul is a Jew. And so they are, in a sense, enemies of the church, he says in Romans 11. Paul then in Romans 15 talks about his desire to go and preach that gospel. He says, I've fulfilled my mission from Jerusalem around to Illyricum, which is in Albania in the Balkans. So he's completed around the north, his mission around the north kind of eastern rim of the Mediterranean, planting churches through Syria, Cilicia, Turkey and Greece, as we would call them. And now he's coming to Rome, and he wants to preach there. And he also wants to go to Spain. Now, Antioch in Syria is an awful long way from Spain, so it's going to be very difficult to conduct his mission as he has from Antioch previously. So he wants to go to Spain. So there's no doubt that he says he wants the Romans to support him in his mission, using a technical term for financial and material support. So Paul really, really wants to take the gospel on. So I think it's fair to say that we can see a number of key aspects of why Paul makes the gospel the centre of Romans. First of all, there's his desire to come to Rome and to embed the gospel there in the church, the gospel of grace through faith, and then to also lead more Romans to Christ, hopefully, and add to that church. But he also wants to go on to Spain. He wants to take the gospel there. So without doubt, one of his passions and desires is that the Romans would join him in that mission. And he probably wants to take co-workers from that church with him. He wants to be financially supported from that church. Who knows? I'm not sure whether he could tent make. There's some discussion and scholarship about whether he could tent make in Spain and support himself. So I think it's fair to say it's pretty obvious that the gospel is a key theme in Romans. Other themes like righteousness, the Spirit, and the other many themes we can find within Romans all fall within the framework of the gospel. Now, I wouldn't want to go as far as to say that Romans is Paul's gospel. It is certainly a presentation of it for that moment. But when we look at the sermons in Acts, we can see that he preaches the gospel in diverse ways. Compare, for example, Acts 13 and 17, the different messages in Athens and in the Pisidian Antioch at the synagogue. If we go to Acts 14, you have his message in Lystra, which is quite similar to Acts 17, where he's preaching to non-Jewish people and the pagan people, as we might call them. So Paul's patterns and modes of preaching the gospel vary greatly, but Romans certainly gives us a huge insight into his gospel and what it entailed.